Carpenter here. I'm going to talk to you about delayed onset muscle soreness and muscle growth. So someone came up to me and said, Ben, I can't get this particular muscle group sore, so I know that it's not growing. And I realised immediately that I had to make a video on this to discuss a little bit of science. So, delayed onset muscle soreness, DOMS or DOMS. Delayed onset muscle soreness is related to exercise-induced muscle damage, EIMD. So it is related to exercise-induced muscle damage, and exercise-induced muscle damage is a mediator of muscular hypertrophy or muscle growth. So it will mediate muscle growth via various pathways, one of which will be activation of satellite cells, one of which will be causing an increase in acute inflammatory response. But going over these in too much detail makes the video way too long and way too boring. So basically, DOMS is related to muscle damage, and muscle damage is a mediator of muscle growth. So basically the question is, do you need to be sore to grow? The answer, throw it out there, get it out of the way, is no. You do not need to be sore to get any kind of muscle growth. So think about this logically. If you started a new program, a novel stimulus tends to be one of the things that creates the most soreness. So if you started a new program today, this program is likely to leave you most sore after the first session, then a little bit after the second session, maybe even the third. But if you repeat that program as is for an extended period of time, you will find that your soreness will dissipate as the exercises stay the same. So if you did that program for 10 weeks, but you were only sore after the first time you did it, the second time you did it, it doesn't mean that your muscle growth has completely ceased after the first couple of workouts. Otherwise, you would have to change your routine every literally 1 or 2 workouts to try and maximize muscle soreness. Now, if we give, let's give another example. If you think of your own personal physique, you'll find that some muscle groups become more sore than others. So it's pretty easy for someone to make their hamstring sore, usually, compared to something like their back or their biceps. But it doesn't mean that their back and their biceps doesn't necessarily grow. So, if I use myself as an example, I find it very hard to get my back very, very sore. But it would be easy for me to do a leg day which stops me walking for a week. But my back, despite the fact it's rarely ever significantly sore, is one of my strongest body parts rather than one of my weakest. So basically, soreness and muscle growth do not have to correlate. Which basically means the question changes. It isn't a case of do you need to be sore to grow, it's could soreness have an additive effect, i.e. could maximise soreness, maximise muscle growth. So let's look into that, let's change the question. So a little bit of background on muscle soreness. Muscle soreness will tend to peak 20 to 48 hours after a routine and will often subside by 5 to 7 days. However, this will depend on a lot of factors. So for example, the modality of exercise, whether you're resistance training, whether you're performing say aerobic training, which could leave you sore, whether there's a high eccentric component, which is associated usually with more soreness than a concentric component. For example, downhill running is associated with a higher amount of muscle damage than say cycling. Things like individual factors, i.e. your own recovery rates, genetic factors, etc. So 2 people could go on the same program, but doesn't necessarily mean that they will be as sore as each other. So here's what we've got. If we address maximising soreness to maximise muscle growth, let's use an example. Let's say we've got a beginner's first day in the gym. Now, beginners are infamous for being able to grow with anything. You can give them a set or a couple of sets, and they will grow well from it. They will grow with whatever you kind of throw at them. So let's say you gave them one exercise per body part, 2 sets, pretty standard, easy routine. They will grow from that. But it isn't a case of the more volume you give someone, the more they will grow. It isn't a linear pattern. Otherwise, you would just perform the most volume possible to get the most growth possible. Now, what you'll find is that for most people, 1 set versus multiple sets will tend to perform less well in terms of muscle growth. So performing multiple sets is usually associated with an increase in muscle growth. However, if you keep that going, it won't keep going. You couldn't say, well, 4 sets works well for growth, so let's do 10, let's do 20, let's do 30. You'll get to a certain point where you will actually regress. An excessive muscle damage will come with a regression rather than a progression. So basically what we're left with is something like a bell curve resembling general adaptation syndrome. I'll link my video on general adaptation syndrome, so if you're on YouTube you can click on it if you want. If you're on Facebook, subscribe on YouTube because this will make no sense. So basically what we're left is a bell curve where you could perform more volume, a little bit of soreness may go hand in hand with that. But if you increase that exponentially, it won't just keep going, it'll actually come with a regression rather than a progression. So basically what we have is if you perform too much work and you are too sore, this is a sign that you have overshot your own recovery abilities and you will have a regression rather than a progression. So not only will it do that, but it will do that from another angle, in that if you take a beginner and you give them an absurdly high volume routine, one, they've done more work than necessary and they're not necessarily going to adapt further. Two, they are also so sore that they won't be able to repeat that routine in the context of their program. So basically, if you have a beginner and you give them a pro bodybuilder's leg routine, they're not really going to grow more than if they did a basic routine. In fact, if anything, they'll regress because it's too much work. But they will also be so sore that they won't be able to repeat that program again. So here's what we're left with. Techniques used to maximize muscle growth may well come with a certain amount of muscle soreness. So if your goal over the course of your career is to become as big and as muscular as possible, some soreness is inevitable within that. So techniques to minimize soreness, for example, doing things like not focusing on the eccentric component of exercise, this isn't necessarily a good idea. So strategically minimizing soreness might not be the best idea, but trying to maximize soreness isn't going to be the best idea ever. So basically what we're left with is, if you're trying to get as big as possible, some soreness is probably inevitable, but using soreness as a gauge of muscle growth is not a good idea. So rather than aiming to try and be as sore as possible, try and progress. Focus on progress, and if you have some soreness within the context of that, that's fine. So is the weight on the bar going up? Are you performing more repetitions with that weight on that exercise? Use that as your measure of progressive overload over time, and that will be the better indicator of muscle growth. Soreness within that is much less important. If you have some soreness, accept that as fine, but don't try and specifically chase soreness at any given opportunity. So that's it. I hope it's helpful. If you've got any questions, please feel free to ask. My Facebook page is facebook.com/Ben Carpenter Personal Training. My Twitter and Instagram pages are both BDC Carpenter. And thank you for watching. Bye.